Welcome back to our panel discussion, 360 Degrees of Government Data, sponsored by MarkLogic here on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. Our guests today are Kevin Shelley, Vice President of Public Sector at MarkLogic. Wolf Tomby is the Chief Technology Officer at U.S. Customs and Border Protection. John Felleman is the Senior Innovation Specialist and Team Lead for the Acquisition Gateway at the General Services Administration's Federal Acquisition Service. George Chambers, Executive Director in the Office of Enterprise Application Development in the Office of the CIO at Health and Human Services. And Colonel Linda Jansen is Acting Director for the Army Architecture Integration Center and the Army's Chief Data Officer. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. And before the break, we were talking about the idea of unlike data sets being used in applications that might be transactional, that might be analytical, and can that somehow come together with the diversity of data that exists out there. And John, I guess you're next in line here to talk about this, but you talked about, again, multiple data sources from unlike systems, and yet the need for the government to get one view of what's going on in, say, acquisition or pricing.
Sure. So as far as what actually gets implemented on the servers, the areas that I'm focused on, which are pulling the data and making it available, are a little bit agnostic. But as as Kevin pointed out, it is a mix. There's a lot of data that is unstructured, and some examples that we have are contracts. So we're collecting contracts across government from many different agencies. A lot of them are scanned from paper. Others are coming out of legacy content systems, which are fairly complicated, and it wouldn't be practical to try and restructure all that or to ask anyone to do that. So we are looking at less structured ways of capturing that data. We're finding a lot of success with open source. So, for example, several of our platforms are using the Solar search engine because it's pretty well adapted to some of this non-structured data. Our prices paid platform, which is being used by a lot of the government procurement community to understand what prices have been paid on various government-wide contracts, is incorporating that. And we also have a tool which we're building out, a statement of work library tool that is all about capturing documents as opposed to contracts or transactions. So I do think it's a mix for sure. You want to be able to take advantage of relational data when it's coming out of a transactional system, but your users also need to be able to get to that other more unstructured information and be able to use it in productive ways.
That really brings up a big point, and maybe, Wolf, you can talk about this one, and that is we've been talking about the data itself and what it's housed in and what kind of database it's housed in. But the other half of that is the application development and whether it has to be a DBA and a report writing expert who is doing the applications, or can some of the subject matter experts, the people who really need the data for purposes of the federal mission or the agency mission, can they get at this type of data in some way that is more efficient once it is housed somewhere in a different type of technology than we're used to over the many decades?
I think the answer to that is a definite yes. So that, again, I'll come back to big data and big data analytical capabilities. And I agree with John, open source is a great way to go for some of those capabilities, and certainly is light on the pocket for the taxpayers. But yeah, if you look at big data, one of its promises is actually to put data and data visualization in the hands of the end user quickly, so that they can look at the data in ways that they never thought possible before. And that they can see the data in ways that gives them that question they never thought to ask. If you're looking at the data of trade and it's like, what's that spike? And where's it coming from? And then you delve down into that and find out, ooh, we have an issue. Well, you never knew to ask that because you didn't know the data was available. So I think that's a tremendous opportunity. The other thing I want to mention, though, is we've talked about the volume of data that's increasing, and it certainly is increasing within the government, and that's definitely true for CBP. So one of the realities, though, is if we try to bring all that data in-house into our infrastructure internally, there's probably not enough money in our budget to pay for all the storage we're going to need, because physical storage, buying it is still fairly expensive. Once you buy it, you have to maintain it, you have to service it, you have to power it, you have to upgrade it, replace it. That's a pretty expensive proposition for the volumes we're talking about. So what we're looking at is what data do we need to house in-house, primarily data that we need sub-second response time on, so things that we query repeatedly, wants and warrants and those kind of things. That has to be stored locally. But a lot of the data, our archive data, our history data, a lot of our sensor data, the video camera feeds coming in, if it's over a week old, do we really need to house that in-house? And think about body-worn cameras. We're exploring those right now. How much data are those going to generate, and how much is it going to cost for storage for all that? Well, one of the things we're looking at right now is cloud storage. And there's some interesting price factors that frankly can't be beat by trying to bring the physical storage devices themselves in-house. And the ability to get through them pretty quickly is there. So, of course, security is an issue. But with many of the vendors out there doing FedRAMP certification, the reality is the vast bulk of our data, a medium, which is what FedRAMP currently is, works just fine for us. So we're actively engaged in how do we put data out in the cloud storage to use, as well as our data that we will have to house in-house, and how do we make both of those work together.
I can just tag on a little bit. I mean, I think that both the open source strategy, which is not just about saving taxpayer money, it's about taking advantage of some of the smartest developers and data analysts in the world who are making those contributions is big. But also the cloud-based strategy. And again, it's not just the acquisition cost. Security is critical. A lot of the vendors of these systems are probably adhering to higher standards than some of our government agencies because they actually have a business that's on the line, and they are much more averse to the kind of embarrassing failure that we also want to avoid. So, I think it's an example of where we can piggyback on the best, whether it's coming from open source, whether it's leveraging a best practice in the private sector, or in some cases where we have very unique skills, looking across to our colleagues, in government. And, I think here today we've heard a couple offers of, wow, we could help you with that. And I think that's pretty exciting. I think the data visualization aspect is also key. And we're very much focused, Tom, on exactly what you said, which is putting more of the data analysis in the hands of the subject matter experts and letting database analysts do what they're great at, which is manage a database. Since we're using an agile development process, we're actually able to turn software around in about 2 weeks. We've released 30 or 35 updates to our gateway since it went live a little over a year ago. And that means if we find a new need, if someone comes up with a new way to analyze data, it's live for our users in 2 weeks, not 2 years. And that's helping us to stay on track. And I think it's a big part of the success that we're going to be seeing in a lot of these systems across government.
Just to continue on this line of thought, I think it really, the whole idea of cloud first is not just about the data. It's bringing the applications into a similar environment along with its authoritative databases. Talks a little bit to what Colonel was mentioning before, is how do we break down the barriers of individual networks and segments. As we are able to bring legacy applications into the cloud, we are enabling a whole new set of tools to be deployed for us to be able to take advantage of the legacy as well as new applications that we're developing. So that at HHS, that's very high on our priority list, is to be able to bring applications, not just the new ones that we're developing, but the ones that are primary mission oriented, into the cloud or a comparable environment, so we can now make use of the new technologies that have been discussed earlier today.
And keeping the end user in mind, none of these tools and processes and capabilities that we've been mentioning are really any good to us unless the end user can make use of it, right? So we think very much about the complexity of these tools. You're going to have complexity anytime you have this type of volume. And yet, by applying the standards, the open standards, the industry recognized standards, we are enabling our our code writers and our database managers to, keep the complexity in the back end. Make it as simple as possible for the user. Enable the creativity of the user to be able to interact with data without the constraints of going through a fixed application, a fixed platform. And on the other hand, when you talk about storage, people use their smartphone and they get their Gmail or whatever they're using. They don't know where that data is stored. And we got to get away from this mindset of my data is in my server and I take my server with me wherever I go. And that's where we get to, that's the value of the cloud enabled computing, which the Army and DoD are going to as well, is it's really distributed. It's distributed storage. It's distributed computing. And that goes back to what, to the question of bringing together multiple data sources to appear as one. Absolutely critical when you're talking about the way the Army operates. Smaller footprint forward, sharing data, and even splitting your staff between who's at home station now at Fort Hood or Fort Campbell and who's forward in the area of operations. And you're actually operating as one staff. So it makes economic sense, but it also adds a capability that we haven't had in the past, along with the big data analytics, where you do derive value that you never even imagined from the ability to look at a variety of data sources and make sense and provide information from them.
Yeah, so Kevin, then the question becomes, as agencies bring unlike data together, in maybe perhaps a single data store, regardless of storage, I think really the question is, with cloud and so forth, is as these environments become more virtualized and the file systems are decentralized and the storage allocations are decentralized, can these newer types of databases hold up in that kind of distributed architecture?
Yeah, absolutely. So if I know there are enterprise NoSQL databases out there that they run on commodity hardware, they scale horizontally. So it's shared nothing architecture, as opposed to some of the older technologies where you got to buy a big server, and if you run out of space, you got to go buy another one. It's very expensive. And they also scale up and down in the cloud, so you can run them on premise or in AWS or the cloud provider of your choice. As far as bringing the different data types together, I talk to some people and ask them what they're using their unstructured data for, and it's like, well, they don't even think about using it because it really doesn't fit into the relational model. The real power is when people are able to combine data sets and then they get an insight and then they start asking questions they didn't even know to think to ask. So the real power is bringing the data together, whether it's in the cloud, on-premise, at headquarters, downrange, because the teams are virtual. And the technology is enabling people to work at home, to be out on the edge in Afghanistan, if it might be. So the new technology is very distributed friendly. The centralized IT shops, they are the dinosaur, right? And that's what created a lot of the silos, is because the centralized IT, it was expensive, slow, and you didn't get good service, so people were setting up shadow IT, right, which created another silo. So, I think the new technologies out there, the enterprise NoSQL databases, are well suited for today's requirements, which are focused on agility and mobility.
All right, so in the time left, why don't we ask the government folks here, if you could get all of these great capabilities, or assuming you're trying to get to them, just tell us two or three, one or two, whatever, of the top issues, top problems, top mission requirements you could solve or would like to solve with this type of technology. We'll start with the Army.
So many. There's so many exciting possibilities, really, for this type of these new technologies and new concepts, if we can make use of them. As I said before, it's really about security. And I'm talking about, when you talk about tagging data, it's more than just being able to find it when you need it. It's also about being able to secure it and make sure that only authorized and accredited users have access to it. So security is going to get better. I think decision support, being able to make decisions in an accelerated fashion, getting insights where you never thought possible, being more efficient in our use of space, our use of energy, all of those things which cost money. and resources and to be able to concentrate on our real core mission and leave the rest to the experts and then leverage those new capabilities. So.
All right. George?
What we've found is that if you look at the consumer, both private industry, the opportunities to expand, I guess, entrepreneurism in the market, as well as individual needs, dealing with health, personal health. We see this as an opportunity to use new technologies to start to bring those silos together. I think it's more about not replacement of relational databases as much as leverage those for the opportunities that new technology can bring us. I don't see us investing a great deal of money rewriting apps so they will go into a non-SQL-oriented data structure as much as allowing the authoritative databases to coexist and overlay technologies that can really take advantage to bring those siloed data and applications into an area where users, and I think the kernel was spot on, where users can define how best to use that data that they don't necessarily understand. I don't think an individual cares whether, a cancer therapy came from NIH or private hospitals that are doing cancer research as much as deliver it all to me so I can make an informed decision.
Okay, John and Wolf, you each get 30 seconds.
Sure. I think it's really easy for us. The government spends about $300 billion every year on acquisition. There are tens of thousands of workers who are trying to do the best job they can. When you talk to them, they spend more time trying to comply with law and policy than finding the best prices and the best terms. And we absolutely believe that when we change that, we're going to save money for taxpayers and we're going to have a better government.
All right, Wolf?
Yeah, so I think the opportunities are to increase the safety of our officers and agents while increasing their ability to be effective at addressing their mission needs while doing so in the most cost-effective way, which I think is what the taxpayers expect of us, and frankly, I think it's what they deserve.
All right, so I guess we can bring on those iota bytes. I want to thank today's guests. Colonel Linda Jansen is the Acting Director of the Army Architecture Integration Center and the Chief Data Officer of the Army. George Chambers is Executive Director at the Office of Enterprise Application Development in the Office of the CIO at Health and Human Services. John Fellerman is Senior Innovation Specialist and Team Lead for the Acquisition Gateway at the GSA's Federal Acquisition Service. Wolf Tomby, Chief Technology Officer at U.S. Customs and Border Protection. And Kevin Shelley, Vice President of Public Sector at MarkLogic. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin, federalnewsradio.com and Federal News Radio 1500 AM.
On behalf of MarkLogic, thank you for joining our discussion. We'll have the archive from this session available shortly, and a link will be sent to you to share with your colleagues. Those of you who requested a training certificate will receive an email with download instructions immediately following the webinar. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you.